On September 11th, 2001, there was a married couple, a man and a woman from India, who were in the two towers of the World Trade Center. The man was in one tower, and the woman was in the other tower. In the midst of the devastation of the terrorist attack, the man and the woman both cried out to God for help, and in some miraculous ways, God answered their prayers, and they both got out of the World Trade Centers before those buildings collapsed. And as a result of that, they both embraced faith in Jesus Christ, converted to Christianity. The man went on to become a full-time evangelist. It's a marvelous story of God's intervention to answer prayer, and I rejoice in the answered prayer that is in evidence in the lives of that couple. But I also am drawn to the stories of the almost 3,000 others on September 11th who died. Many of them who with equal fervency and honesty cried out to God to be saved, and God chose not to answer their prayers. Nofel Staten was a professor of mine and Claudia's when we were in Bible college. He tells the story of his sister, his twin sister, in October of 1984, who was diagnosed with breast cancer. And so she called Nofel to tell him and said to him that they are going to do surgery tomorrow to remove the lump, and then I'll have follow-up treatments of various kinds. And so Nofel, right then on the phone, he prayed for his sister, and he asked God to intervene on her behalf and to remove the lump. And in fact, he made a very specific prayer that God would intervene in such a way that the next day the doctor would not be able to find the lump and she would not have to have surgery. He received a call from his sister late the next day in which she said, "Guess what? When I went to the hospital for surgery, they couldn't find the lump, and so they did a mammogram and it wasn't there. And I didn't have to have surgery." A marvelous answer to Nofel's prayers. He also tells in the same writing another story that occurred just a few months earlier. June 1984, his best friend Kurt was diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia. He went through aggressive treatments for the leukemia and handled them amazingly well. He didn't get sick. He didn't lose his hair. The treatments were incredibly effective in halting the leukemia that was ravishing his body. And the doctors were ready to release him from the hospital, and so Nofel went to visit him on the night before his friend Kurt was to be released from the hospital. He left the hospital about 9:30 that night after having prayed that God would continue to restore Kurt's life and that he would restore him back to full health. Nofel went home. Shortly after he got home, he got a call from Kurt's wife, and very unexpectedly, Kurt had died. Prayed for his sister, and God miraculously answered. He prayed for his best friend, and he died. On December 29th, 2010, there were 150 car accidents in or near Spokane, Washington. It was a very snowy and icy day. 150 car accidents, but only one fatality, my daughter. Do you think that Becky is the only one for whom no one prayed that she would be safe as she drove? Do you think that Becky is the only one injured for whom no one prayed that God would bring her back to health, restore her, and heal her? Well, I can tell you that if that's what you think, you're wrong. On that particular day, in that particular situation, God did not answer my prayers, our prayers, in the ways that we wanted God to answer our prayers. I am personally and painfully aware that God does not always answer our prayers in the way we want Him to. And I know that each one of you is also personally and painfully aware that God has not always answered your prayers in the ways that you wanted God to answer your prayers. The Bible and history alike tell us great stories of marvelous and miraculous answers to prayer, and each one of us could share stories from our own lives and our own prayers where God has intervened and God has answered in some remarkable ways. And the Bible and history alike also tell us stories of times when God did not answer prayer. And you and I can add our own sad stories in which that truth is very clear. So the question then that we're all interested in is, why doesn't God answer all our prayers? And I would remind us that we're not the only ones nor the first ones who have asked that question. Go all the way back into the Old Testament, the book of Habakkuk. And Habakkuk says in Habakkuk 1, verse 2, "How long, O Lord, must I cry for help, and you do not listen, or cry out to you violence, but you do not save?" David wrote in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry out to you by day, but you do not answer. By night, I am not silent." Now, I do think prayer, in many ways, is a mystery, and I don't think we'll ever fully come to understand why it is that God answers some prayers and why God doesn't answer all of our prayers, at least in the ways that we want Him to. But there are some things that I've learned, and I thought a lot about this, particularly over the last 3 years. There are some things that I've learned, some principles that impact our prayers that I wanted to share with you this morning. The first one is the principle of the consequences of free will decisions. This principle is stated clearly in the Old Testament. It's also stated in the New Testament. This is the principle of sowing and reaping. So Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 22, verse 8, "He who sows wickedness reaps trouble. You reap what you sow." That's what Solomon said. And Paul makes that principle even clearer when he writes in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, "Do not be deceived, God cannot be mocked. Whatever a man sows, he also reaps." You reap what you sow. You make good decisions, you reap the results of those good decisions. You make bad choices, you reap the results of those bad choices. The vast majority of the time, God allows that principle, which He has built into His creation, the vast majority of the time, God allows that principle to play out in our lives. Let me give you an example, a simple example from Oregon life. If you go out in one of those frequent days when it is raining in Oregon, without wearing a hat, without using an umbrella, how often do you expect to get wet? Every time. You expect that principle to work in this world. You expect to get wet when it's raining. You expect that principle to be the way that the world works. You expect that principle to be the way that God works, and it is the way that God works most of the time. Pascal called this principle the dignity of causality, that God has chosen to govern the world in partnership with mankind. God has chosen to allow our free will actions, our free will decisions to be ours to make and allow us then to feel the consequences, either good or bad, of those decisions, choices that we make. In fact, God has given mankind so much freedom that He allows us to oppress each other. He allows us to rebel against Him. He even allows us to kill His own Son. C.S. Lewis said that we can best imagine the world not as a state governed by an all-powerful ruler, but rather as a work of art, as a play, with God as the playwright, and God as the playwright allows His characters to affect the play itself. And yet, in an incredible demonstration of both wisdom and creativity, He incorporates all of those free will actions and free will decisions of the characters in His play and still arrives at His predetermined end. If God were to answer every prayer, He would have to suspend the principle of natural consequences. So, there are a lot of you students that are here today. So I'll ask you a question. You don't have to raise your hand because it'd be embarrassing. But how many of you would study if all you had to do when you walked into the room to take the test was to pray that God would give you an A? Yeah, not me either. Okay. There's a few of you here in the congregation who are engineers, and I know enough about engineering to know that you engineers have to do some pretty difficult calculations, work out these hard, complex engineering problems. How many of you would spend the hours that are necessary to work out those hard engineering problems if God would suspend the principle of consequences and just pop the answer into your mind? We'd all like it if God would do that. I, personally, would eat cinnamon rolls and biscuits and gravy every breakfast. I'd have pizza buffet at lunch and eat steak and potatoes with pie for dessert every evening. If God would just suspend the principle of consequences so that those free will choices didn't have negative impacts on my health and didn't have negative impacts on my size. But that's not the way the world works. That's not generally the way God works. Now, we would certainly mess the world up far more than we already have if God did suspend that principle of consequences. Someone once asked Mahatma Gandhi, if you were given the power to remake the world, what would you do first? And Gandhi said, I would pray for the power to renounce that power. Because Gandhi knew he couldn't handle all the decisions that he would have to make to rule the world. He'd mess it up far more than it was already messed up. And I tell you what, I don't want you guys to have that power either. And I don't want to have that power. We already look around us and we see the way in which our decisions have messed up the world. War and oppression and slavery and all kinds of debauchery and conflict. Those are all the results of our free will decisions. And if we were given even greater opportunity to make free will decisions without consequences, we would mess the world up far more. Now, sometimes God does choose to interrupt the principle of consequences. And that's what we call an answered prayer. That God, by His grace, chooses to interrupt that principle. But generally speaking, God doesn't do that. He certainly doesn't always do that. Perhaps He doesn't even often do that. When God finished the creation of the world, He looked at all that He created, and God said it was very good, including the principle of consequences. Everything that God had created, He thought it was a good creation. He was pleased with the way that He designed the world, and He generally allows the principles that He has put into this world to play themselves out in the way that He has designed them to. That's the principle of consequences. Secondly, there's the principle of complexity. That is, some prayer requests are impossible even for God to answer. That's the age-old philosophical question that perhaps you've heard before. Can God create a boulder too heavy for God to lift? It's an impossible question to answer. It's a logical impossibility. In the same way, there are some prayers, the answer to which are mutually exclusive. The farmer prays for rain, and the baseball player prays for sun. They both cannot be answered in the way that those two people want them answered, at least at the same time in the same place. Right now, this very moment, 10 minutes from now, is kickoff. We won't be done by then, by the way. But 10 minutes from now is kickoff. And there are thousands of people in Boston who are praying that the Patriots will win. And there are thousands of people praying in Denver that the Broncos will be victorious. Those prayers are mutually exclusive. Only one of those two teams is going to win. We're praying it's the Broncos, by the way. But anyway, the principle is both of those prayers cannot be answered. Abraham Lincoln talked about that principle when he was talking about the two sides in the Civil War. He said, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes His aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has His own purposes. You see that principle at work in the life and ministry of Jesus. When James and John and their mother came to Jesus with a request, it was a prayer, and they came to Him with this request. The mother of the Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, she asked a favor of Him. What is it you want, He asked. And she said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. Now, the only way that prayer could be answered would be if they were the only two that asked for those two positions in all of history. And that if anybody else asked for one of those two positions, then God would not be able to answer all the prayers affirmatively. Okay, it was mutually exclusive. There are only two hands to Jesus. Or let me remind you of this. Who is it that sits at the left hand of Jesus? Think about that. Scripture says that Jesus sits at the right hand of His Father, which means that the Father sits at the left hand of Jesus. So in order for Jesus or God to be able to answer that prayer from James and John and their mother, Jesus would have had to displace his Father. That wasn't going to happen. It was a prayer that could not be answered. And I'm sure that you and I have prayed some prayers like that simply could not be answered. There is also, thirdly, the principle of purpose. There are things God wants to do in our lives that he accomplishes by not answering our prayers. So that sickness and disease and death and financial hardship and relational struggles and the toil of work and the other difficulties that we experience over the course of our life, which largely are the consequence of Adam's sin, God takes those things and he uses those things to accomplish some things in our lives and some things in our world too. Paul told the Romans in Romans chapter 5, we also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. Those sufferings produce some things in our lives, and God wants to see those things produced in us, and the way that he produces those things is by allowing us to go through some difficulties and suffering. James made the same point. James chapter 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. There are things that God wants to accomplish in us that require us to go through difficulties. Things like perseverance, things like character, things like hope, things like maturity and completeness. Those require that we go through suffering and hardship and difficulties of many kinds. Consider the prayer of the Apostle Paul. Paul experienced something that he called a thorn in the flesh. Now, I don't know what that was. I have some ideas, but I'm not sure what that was. But I know this much about his thorn in the flesh, that it was not pleasant for the Apostle Paul. And so he cried out to God and asked for God to take it away. Scripture says, Paul says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. And God's answer to Paul was no. Paul said, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Basically, God said to Paul, I want you to have that thorn in the flesh. You're going to learn some things from that thorn in the flesh. You're going to learn from that thorn in the flesh how sufficient my grace is for you, even when you have to deal with that thorn in the flesh. You're going to learn how much I can use you in your weakness, that I don't require your strength. I can use you in your weakness. You're going to learn that. Paul would mention earlier why it was that God allowed him to continue to experience that thorn. He said, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassingly great revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan. God was accomplishing some good things in Paul because of or through the thorn in the flesh that he allowed Paul to experience. So that when Paul asked God to take that thorn away, God said no, because of his purpose in Paul's life to accomplish some things through that thorn in the flesh. Our oldest daughter, Kristen, was a very early walker. She started walking when she was 10 months old. I mean, it was wobbly, but she was walking at 10 months old. We were living in a small town in Kansas at the time. I was preaching at a church there, and we lived in the parsonage next door. It was an old house. And they had taken the back porch of this old house, and they'd closed it in and made it into a laundry room. But there was a small step from the kitchen back into the laundry room. One day, Claudia decided to go do some laundry in the laundry room, and she left Kristen alone in the kitchen. She stepped out of the kitchen into the back porch. The screen door went closed. Claudia didn't turn around and look and recognize that Kristen was following her, and Kristen toddled out, opened the door, stepped down into the laundry room, but she wasn't walking very steadily, and she lost her balance. Now, this was a very, very cold day in Kansas, and so the heat was on in the laundry room. And Kristen looked for something that she could balance herself or catch herself on. And what she chose was this you may have seen these things before, this little bitty, short, white porcelain heater. And she put her hand, palm down, on the top of that very, very hot porcelain heater and screamed in pain. Claudia grabbed her up, ran over to the church next door where I was in my office. We got in the car and we headed toward Emporia, where the hospital was, about 25 miles away. While we were driving, Claudia held Kristen in her lap and put her hand on the very cold glass that was next to her. By the way, that was in the days before car seat laws, so it was okay. And all the way in to Emporia, we were praying, and Claudia was holding Kristen. Kristen was crying. When we got to the hospital, they said that she had third-degree burns on her hand. And they treated it, and they said that she was going to have several follow-up treatments in order that the hand wouldn't be scarred or crippled. And so a couple of days later, Claudia took her back to the hospital for a follow-up treatment. And they took the bandages off Kristen's hand, and they put it in this whirlpool bath of warm water. And then they removed her hand from the water. And while Claudia held her, they cut off the dead and dying skin. And it was a painful process for, I think it's called debriding, a painful process for Kristen. It was a successful process, by the way. She has no scars and no crippling on that hand. But anyway, it was a painful process that she was going through. And while Claudia held her, while the doctors and nurses were dealing with her hand, Kristen was screaming in pain and crying that they'd stop. This is what Claudia says about that time. Kristen did not rest peacefully in my lap, appreciating the effort that I was making in keeping her from being crippled. She cried long and loud. I can only imagine her broken heart as her mommy participated in this painful procedure and held her down so that it could happen. I could have stopped what was happening, could have picked her up and walked out of the room, but I didn't. And clearly, I did what I did completely because I loved her. But there was no way that Kristen could have understood that what was happening to her was an act of love. The mind of a 10-month-old cannot comprehend what's going on in the mind of a 24-year-old. And in the same way, or a similar way at least, it's impossible for us to fully comprehend what God is trying to accomplish in us. Sometimes it seems incredibly painful to us. And yet God holds us lovingly and allows us to go through that pain because He knows the good things that are being accomplished in our lives through the pain that we're experiencing. The difficulties of this life and the struggles that we face help us to set our hearts toward heaven. Earlier in 2 Corinthians, in the 5th chapter, Paul wrote, "Now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling." Our struggles here in this life help us focus on the eternity, where there will be perfect peace and perfect joy for all of eternity. And the uncertainty and the imperfections of this world and of our lives, they drive us to the certainty of God and the perfection of the eternity for which we await. Paul told the Romans, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. And not only so, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies." If God were to take away all the imperfections that we experience in this life, and in this world, then our hearts would be even more firmly attached to this life and this world. And I will tell you that our hearts are already very attached to this life and this world. But if this world were removed from all of its imperfections, if God answered all of our prayers, then there would be little longing in our hearts for heaven, and rather a firmer attachment to what's going on here in this world. He wants our hearts and our minds attached to Him. He wants our hearts and our minds attached, drawn toward that perfection that will be ours, that we will experience in heaven. And part of the way that He releases us from the attachment that we have to this world is through the pain and the suffering that we experience. And I know for many of you, you don't yet know this, some of you do. But the older you get, the more you experience the loss of those that you love, the more that you experience the deterioration of your own physical body, the more you see the pain and the heartache in the world around you, the weaker and weaker your attachment to the world becomes. The stronger and the stronger the draw toward heaven is. That's what God wants. And that's the way He's designed this world. There are things God wants to do in the world that He accomplishes by not answering our prayers. I'm drawn to the prayer of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus cried out to his Father 3 times. He cried out to his Father, "Take this cup away from me. My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me." Matthew chapter 26. How could the Father who loved Jesus so much, "This is my Son whom I love," he says. How could the Father who loved Jesus so much say no to this honest and heartfelt and fervent request that Jesus made of him to take away this cup that he knew he had to suffer? God the Father said no to his deeply loved Son in order to say yes to our redemption. The sacrifice of Jesus was worth the pain that it cost because of what it accomplished in the world. Job went through horrible sufferings. How could God say no to Job, who was so faithful to him, whom he loved so much? Why did God say no? God said no to Job because of his purposes, what he was trying to accomplish. Through the way Job handled those sufferings, God accomplished things in the battle that was going on between him and Satan, a battle that we could not see. Fourthly, and this ties right in, is the principle of demonic opposition. There is a battle going on in heaven that influences what happens on earth. And the clearest illustration of that we get an opportunity to look into is in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 10. It says, "In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a revelation was given to Daniel, who's called Belteshazzar. Its message was true, and it concerned a great war. The understanding of the message came to him in a vision. At that time, I, Daniel, mourned for 3 weeks." So here's the season of great distress for Daniel. He's mourning, he's crying out in prayer to God. But for 3 weeks, it is as if God has gone deaf. It is as if he's closed the gates of heaven and he's not hearing what Daniel is saying. But that wasn't true. And we get an opportunity to glimpse in to what was happening in heaven at that same time. It says, "An angel came to Daniel and said, 'Do not be afraid, Daniel. Since the first day that you set your heart or your mind to gain understanding and to humble yourself before your God, your words were heard.'" God heard you from day one. "And I have come in response to them." God heard him, God answered him from day one. "But the prince of the Persian kingdom," that's some kind of demonic being, "the prince of the Persian kingdom resisted me 21 days. And then Michael, one of the chief princes, an archangel, came to help me because I was detained there with the king of Persia. Now I've come to explain to you what will happen to your people in the future, for the vision concerns a time yet to come." What we get a picture of in that passage is a battle that's going on in heaven that we cannot see and we don't know about. And yet it influences what God is able to do in this world. So there are things that are happening that we simply do not understand. We don't know all that's going on in heaven. And one more principle, it's the principle of corruption. Sometimes our prayers are corrupted, and that corruption hinders God's willingness to answer. God doesn't answer selfish prayers. James says in James chapter 4, "When you ask, you do not receive, because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures selfishly." God doesn't answer selfish prayers. God requires of our prayers perseverance. That's the principle that Jesus teaches in that parable in Luke chapter 18. Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. And sometimes our prayers are corrupted. We don't keep praying with the kind of perseverance that God requires. And Jesus talked about the corruption of the prayers of the people in his age in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. He says, "And when you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love to pray, standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by men." Their prayers were corrupt. "I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, pray to your Father who is unseen, and then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, don't keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words." Their prayers were corrupt. "Don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you even ask." So sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers because of the corruption of our prayers. And sometimes our lives are corrupted. And that corruption keeps God from answering. Peter reminds husbands about how the way they treat their wives can impact God's answers to their prayers. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, "Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner, as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers." Which means if you don't treat your wives right, It will hinder your prayers. Sometimes our lives are corrupt, and that keeps God from answering our prayers. That's the word that the Lord spoke through the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 1, when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Even if you offer many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Or the word that comes from the psalmist in Psalm 66, if I had cherished sin in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. Sometimes it's the corruption of our lives that keeps God from answering our prayers. So there are a lot of principles, and those are just some that I would share with you. I'm sure there are others that I haven't thought of that I can't share with you today because I haven't thought of them yet. But those are just some of the things that I've gleaned that I think influence our prayers, and sometimes are the reasons why God does not answer our prayers. Let me close with a story that comes from Philip Yancey, his book Prayer, which I highly recommend, by the way. It's a story that's told by Charles White, who's a professor from Michigan who spent a semester in Nigeria. And while he was in Nigeria, he visited a graveyard. It was a missionary graveyard. 56 graves. Of those 56 graves, 33 of them were the graves of children. The children of the missionaries who died of the diseases that were common in Nigeria or of accidents that occurred while their parents were serving the Lord, preaching the gospel in the region of Nigeria. White writes, the graveyard at Miango tells us something about God and about His grace. It testifies that God is not a jolly grandfather who satisfies our every desire. Certainly those missionaries wanted their children to live. They pled with God. He denied their requests. The graves also show us that God is not a calculating merchant who withholds His goods until we produce enough good works or faith to buy His help. If anyone had earned credit with God, it would have been those missionaries. They left all they had to spread the gospel in a hostile environment. But God does not hand out merit pay. Not only do we learn about God's nature from the Miango graveyard, but we also discover truths about His grace. God's grace may be free, but it is not cheap. Purchasing our salvation cost God the death of His own Son. And letting the world know about that sacrifice is expensive for those who preach the gospel. Beginning with Abel, many of the witnesses of divine grace sealed their words with their own blood. Jesus asked the Jews, which of the prophets was not persecuted? When He first sent out His disciples, He promised them betrayal and death. And at the end of His ministry, He promised His followers that as they carried His word, they would face trouble and hatred. The only way we can understand the graveyard at Miango, White concludes, is to remember that God also buried His Son on a mission field. What God accomplished through the death of His Son was worth it. It was worth it to me because it resulted in my redemption. Worth it to you. And God says it's worth it to Him. The sacrifice, the suffering of His Son was worth it because of what it accomplished in us for His kingdom. And the suffering that we face, it's worth it too. We don't always know how. We don't always see it. But it's worth it. Because God is accomplishing things in us, and God is accomplishing things through us that are worth the suffering and the difficulties that we go through here in this life. The missionary who stands beside the grave of his son on the mission field in Nigeria finds no logical explanation for unanswered prayers, and I don't find any logical explanation either. For that missionary, and for you and me too, the only course of action that's left is to choose to put his faith in a God who has yet to unveil the final chapter of His plan, who has yet to fulfill the promise that good will overcome evil, and that His good purposes will ultimately prevail. For some, that conclusion seems like the ultimate rationalization. But for we who embrace faith in Jesus, that conclusion is the ultimate act of faith. So the final question then about unanswered prayer is this: are we willing to trust God's love and to trust that God knows what He's doing? even when he says no. Let's pray. Father God, we would gladly today thank you for answered prayer. And I know most of us could testify about answers that we've received to our prayers. And so we gladly rejoice in those, celebrate those, thank you for those. But God, by faith today, we also thank you for unanswered prayer. In Jesus' name, amen.